A lone lantern flickers on the porch of a remote ranch house in Arizona territory. Harriet Dunn, a widow with a weary heart and determined spirit, never expects much past sundown, except the echo of wolves across the plains. But tonight is different. A wounded stranger collapses at her door, breathing just enough to plead for her help. She can't turn him away, though she suspects danger in his eyes. When she discovers his hidden gold coin, emblazoned with a name whispered in wanted posters, her safe, solitary world twists in an instant. She has no idea her life is about to collide with a perilous, glittering secret. The Arizona Territory in 1883 was vast and unforgiving. Dry winds scraped the earth, and cacti bristled against a blazing sun by day, and chilled moonlight by night. For years, Harriet Dunn, a widow of 35, had lived on the frontier's edge with little comfort but her memories and the small ranch left to her by her late husband, Patrick. A hard worker by nature, Harriet found herself toiling from dawn until after dusk, mending fences and caring for a handful of livestock, herding them in from meager pastures under the relentless desert sun. Everyone in town, if you could even call it a town, knew Harriet for her silent resilience. She'd married Patrick at 17, young and starry-eyed in the bustling city of Philadelphia. They left the East in search of a better life out west, seduced by the promise of land. After all, land was freedom. But that dream had come with a heavy price. Patrick had died 3 years earlier of a rattlesnake bite while searching for stray cattle. He'd collapsed in agony on the range alone and unable to call for help. By the time Harriet found him, it was far too late. She buried him on a gentle slope that overlooked the ranch, where an old mesquite tree seemed to bow its branches as if in constant mourning. Harriet's neighbors were few and far between. The closest ranch was nearly 10 miles down a dusty track, and sometimes she'd ride over for Sunday coffee with the Jensen family. But Harriet preferred solitude. She didn't shun company entirely. She was simply accustomed to fending for herself, shaping her world by her own determination. The ring on her finger, a simple gold band, was a token of her unyielding devotion to Patrick's memory. She never took it off, even though more than one frontier bachelor had cast curious glances her way. Her little home was plain, a single-story adobe structure built with sweat and second-hand timber. It had taken Patrick nearly 2 years to complete. He'd insisted Harriet have a real roof rather than a ramshackle tent, and the little cabin had expanded into a modest ranch house over time. Now the exterior paint was peeling. The shutters rattled in the wind, and the porch creaked underfoot. Yet for Harriet, it was still home. Each evening, after feeding the livestock and tending her modest vegetable patch, Harriet settled into her rocking chair by the porch. She'd watch the sunset, recollect stories from the past, and let her mind drift amid the shifting desert shadows. She had no illusions that life would bring big changes, but she found small pleasures in routine, unaware how quickly fate can alter the calm. On a cool evening in mid-fall, Harriet was performing her nightly ritual of dousing the lanterns. A few cicadas buzzed in the distance, and a slim silver moon hovered low in the sky. She was nearly ready to retire when she heard a faint rustling like boots dragging in the dirt, followed by a sharp gasp of pain. Her heart hammered. Could it be some wounded animal? Could it be a thief lurking in the darkness? She stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. The hush of the night was almost suffocating, broken only by a labored cough. She squinted past the starlight and saw movement near the corner of the house. Cautiously, Harriet approached her finger on the trigger. Then she saw him, A man crumpled on the ground, his body half in the shadows. Blood was seeping from his side, staining his torn shirt. He looked up, and in the lantern light she caught the reflection of two desperate, pain-filled eyes. He whispered in a raw, ragged voice, "Ma'am, please, help me." In that moment, Harriet's heart clenched with pity and fear. Though the man was a stranger, she couldn't refuse him. With steady resolve, she knelt beside him. She felt warmth against her fingers as she tried to staunch the blood. He was losing too much. She had to act fast. Dragging him inside, Harriet lowered him onto an old bed in what once served as a spare bedroom. She didn't know who he was, nor if bringing him inside would invite danger. But the man was dying. That was clear. Harriet grabbed clean rags and water setting about to treat the wound. She had some small experience with frontier doctoring, enough to know how to remove a bullet and slow bleeding. As the night wore on, Harriet discovered a single bullet lodged in his rib cage. With trembling hands, she used Patrick's old surgical kit, carefully removing the slug, while the man convulsed. His fever spiked. She prayed he wouldn't die on her watch. If he did, she might have trouble explaining to the law how he ended up under her roof. For the moment, Harriet pushed all those thoughts aside. Saving his life was her only focus. Outside, the wind began to wail across the open plains. While Harriet worked, she wondered, "Who is he?" Her question would soon be answered, but not without grave consequences. Morning light slanted through the thin curtains, illuminating the sweat-covered stranger. Harriet dozed in a chair by his bedside, arms folded over her apron. She'd fought to keep him alive through the night, cleaning the wound as best she could, applying a heated compress to staunch infection. His breathing had evened out an hour or so before sunrise. Now, as Harriet awoke with a stiff neck, she found her patient's eyes open, fixed on the small window that overlooked the dusty yard. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice rasping. "My ranch," Harriet replied in a guarded tone. "Found you half dead outside. You're lucky you didn't bleed to death." She poured a cup of water, offering it gently. He sipped, coughing, eyes flicking about. He seemed uncertain, perhaps unnerved by Harriet's austere presence. "Name's Harriet Dunn," she said, deciding courtesy might soften his worry. "You?" He hesitated, eyes darting as if measuring how much he should reveal. Finally, he mumbled, "Names can get a man killed in these parts." "Don't expect I care one way or another," Harriet retorted, though her heart hammered with curiosity. "But I'd like to know who I'm risking my neck for." A moment of silence, and then he exhaled. "Goes by Gideon Cole," he offered, though the glance in his eyes suggested that might not be his only name. "Thank you, Harriet, for patching me up." She studied his features, angular jaw, sun-baked skin, and hair damp with feverish sweat. He looked to be in his late 30s, possibly older. There was something about his eyes, a flicker of remorse, or maybe a life worn thin by hardship. Harriet had seen enough drifters to know he'd been through trouble. She nodded curtly and reached for fresh bandages to rebind his wound. "Bullet tore you up bad," she said, focusing on the job. "Lucky it didn't bust a lung. You need rest, but if you're running from the law, you best speak up. I don't tolerate no trouble." The corner of Gideon's mouth twitched in something akin to a smirk, but it vanished quickly. He stiffened with pain when Harriet pressed the bandage to his side. "I'm not an outlaw, if that's what you're asking," he lied, though Harriet couldn't be certain. "I got in a scuffle with some unsavory men. They tried to rob me near Willow Creek. Put a bullet in me. Harriet's expression hardened. Willow Creek is at least 20 miles from here. You dragged yourself an awful long way. His lips pressed together, perhaps bracing for a storm of questions. Was hoping to find a doctor, he murmured. Guess I got lucky instead. She refrained from pressing further. Instead, Harriet finished wrapping the dressing. You'll need a few days to heal if infection don't take hold, she said firmly. But I can't have you bringing trouble to my doorstep. If someone comes around looking for you, I won't cause you grief, Gideon said with a weary nod. I owe you my life. Harriet didn't respond. She had no illusions about how easily that promise might be broken if a posse came sniffing. Instead, she stood, collected the blood-stained rags in a pail, and left Gideon to rest. In her modest kitchen, she stoked the small stove and prepared a weak broth, mindful that he'd need nourishment. As she stirred, her mind spun. Who was Gideon Cole, really? Thieves, outlaws, and desperados seemed to breed like jackrabbits in this territory. For all Harriet knew, he was part of some gang. But he was at her mercy now, and despite her rough exterior, Harriet had a conscience. She brought him the broth. He sipped it, gratitude shining in his eyes. I'll repay you, he said quietly, setting down the bowl. There's no need, Harriet replied. Just get well enough to leave. I've lost too much already in this life. Don't care to lose more. He lowered his gaze, and Harriet felt a twinge of pity. But she pushed the emotion aside. Survival out here demanded caution, not tenderness. Through the partially open door, Harriet caught a glimpse of the ranch yard, a few hens pecking in the dirt, a single mule wandering near the fence. She had chores to see to, and not enough time for pity. With a stiff nod, she left Gideon to rest, unprepared for how swiftly the world would intrude on her small sanctuary, and how Gideon Cole's secrets were about to upend everything she thought she knew. 2 days passed. Harriet poured her energy into managing the ranch, feeding her livestock, tending the vegetable patch, and hauling water from the well. Each time she entered Gideon's makeshift sick room, the tension between them was palpable. She brought him fresh water and meager rations of bread and broth. He improved slowly, managing to sit upright by the second day, though pain still etched lines across his face. Harriet remained curt, but on the third morning Gideon mustered enough strength to leave the bed, hobbling around the small room. Harriet found him leaning against the windowsill, looking out at her dusty yard. You ought to be in bed, she remarked, crossing her arms. He turned the corners of his mouth, lifting in a subdued smile. There's only so much lying down a man can take. Thought I might speed up the healing with a bit of movement. You're liable to tear open that wound, Harriet warned. But there was something else about him. She noticed he wasn't just restless. He seemed worried, checking the horizon as if expecting trouble. Harriet's curiosity flared. Expecting someone, she asked, trying to keep suspicion out of her voice. Gideon shook his head, though he didn't meet her gaze. Don't know, he replied cryptically. Life has a way of surprising a man out here. Harriet exhaled. Enough was enough. Look, Mr. Cole, you need to level with me. If there are folks after you, I deserve to know. He was silent a moment, jaw set. Finally, he turned to face her. Truth is, Harriet, I'm wanted by certain men who believe I have something of theirs, but it isn't theirs at all. That was as cryptic as it was alarming. Harriet kept her composure. If this something you speak of is stolen. No, Gideon said sharply, then lowered his voice. I didn't steal anything. But there's gold, a fortune if I'm being honest, and some dangerous men want it. A chill crawled up Harriet's spine. Gold was a powerful motivator and an equally potent killer. She recalled the gold rush mania that had swept California years before the greed, violence, and heartbreak that followed. "So you're in possession of stolen gold?" Gideon met her gaze. "I never said stolen. This gold rightfully belongs to me. Let's just say I inherited it from a questionable source. But to certain folks, that doesn't matter." Harriet struggled to quell her sudden dread. A man in her home, carrying the weight of a fortune, could draw unspeakable danger. "You brought that fortune here?" she asked quietly. "Onto my ranch?" Gideon hesitated, then reached into his pocket. He pulled out a single coin, smooth and shimmering, despite the faint patina. He held it out, the flicker of sunlight catching Harriet's eye. She carefully took it in her palm, her breath catching as she recognized the foreign mint. On one side was a portrait of Emperor Maximilian. It looked as though it could have come from Mexico or possibly from a stash of Spanish gold. "This is just one piece," he said in a hushed tone. "There's more. Enough to change a life. I was trying to reach Tucson, where I have a contact who can help me put these coins to better use. But my enemies tracked me. That's how I got the bullet." Harriet could sense the truth in his words. His intensity was too raw to be an elaborate lie. She handed the coin back, uncertain. "Why tell me?" "Because you saved me," Gideon replied simply. "If I hadn't been so desperate, I wouldn't have involved you. But now it's only fair you know. If trouble rides this way—" His voice trailed off. Harriet's gut twisted. She had no intention of becoming embroiled in an outlaw affair, but she also recalled her vow never to turn away a dying man. Out here, compassion and survival rarely mixed well. The silence hung between them like a taut string, ready to snap. Finally, Harriet turned toward the door. "You'll need to leave as soon as you can walk," she stated, her tone laced with resignation. "I can't afford to get mixed up in a hunt for gold." Gideon let out a slow breath, nodding. "I understand." But neither spoke of how complicated it might be to travel with a gunshot wound, or how once certain men discovered his trail, Harriet's ranch might become a battlefield. In the days that followed, Harriet wrestled with guilt and fear. She'd done what any decent person would, yet decency in the West could come at a steep price. On the fourth evening after Gideon's arrival, Harriet tended her garden under the last rays of sunlight, mind racing. The thought of hidden gold, violent men, and Gideon's cryptic story weighed heavily. She tried to push it aside, focusing on everyday tasks, pulling weeds, checking for any sign of pests on her sprouting vegetables. Suddenly, a trail of dust appeared on the horizon. Harriet straightened, peering into the distance. 2 riders were approaching, swiftly. Anxiety gnawed her insides. She hurried to the house, quietly alerting Gideon. He grew tense when he peered out the window. "Likely not the Jensen boys," he muttered, referencing Harriet's neighbors. When the riders came into full view, Harriet saw they wore dusty coats and broad hats, guns slung at their hips. Each had a hardened look about him as though used to rough living. Harriet stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, but not raised. She forced her voice to remain steady. "Evenin'," she greeted, as they slowed to a halt near the corral. One man, tall with a grizzled beard, dipped his hat. "Evenin', ma'am. We're looking for a friend of ours. Goes by Gideon Cole. Heard tell he might have come this way." Harriet's stomach clenched. "They know his name." She maintained a stony expression. "I live alone. Haven't seen a stranger pass through." The second man, shorter but broad-shouldered, glanced past Harriet toward the house. "Sure about that?" "We were told someone with a bullet wound might show up." "I wouldn't know," Harriet replied, voice taut. He scanned the yard, dismounting slowly. Harriet noted the well-worn grip of his revolver, the readiness in his eyes. The tall one remained on his horse, eyes fixed on Harriet, a faint sneer tugging his lips. "We aim to check your place if you don't mind," the shorter man said. "I do mind," Harriet snapped, heart pounding. "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm a widow living on my own. You've got no right to barge in." The tall man let out a low chuckle. "We do if we suspect you're harboring a wanted thief. Gideon Cole stole something valuable from us, ma'am. We plan on getting it back." Harriet's grip on her rifle tightened. She realized the men might force their way inside. She prayed Gideon would stay hidden, or at least be armed. Before either man could make a move, thunder rumbled across the desert, the sky quickly darkening with a roll of heavy clouds. The tall man spat in the dirt. "Storm's coming." The shorter one locked eyes with Harriet. "We'll be back, ma'am, and if we find out you've been lying, well, that'd be a real shame." They mounted up, turning their horses. Harriet stood rooted on the porch rifle, unwavering. She didn't lower it until the riders disappeared behind a swath of sagebrush. Only then did she let out the breath she'd been holding, her hands shaking with a rush of adrenaline. She hurried inside to find Gideon at a crack in the door, his face pale. "They're the ones," he said quietly, voice trembling with anger. "They're part of the Grady gang. They want the gold." "Will they think you stole it?" Harriet shot back. Gideon shook his head. "It's more complicated than that. Their boss, Leon Grady, was the one who actually robbed a stagecoach carrying those coins. I was just, let's call it a reluctant partner. I turned on him when I realized the gold was meant to be used to bankroll a massacre of sorts. Some business with Mexican landowners. I took the stash, hoping to prevent the bloodshed. But now the gang wants it back." Harriet stared at him, conflicted. "So it is stolen from them." "It was stolen from the stagecoach," Gideon corrected, weariness in his eyes. "From the old Emperor Maximilian's minted collection. Some collector in California purchased them. None of it's legal or right, but I'd rather see it returned to the rightful owners or put to better use than line Grady's pockets. They'll kill innocents, Harriet." A swirl of worry filled Harriet's chest. "They'll come back, likely with more men. I can't fight off a whole gang." Gideon rested against the doorframe, wincing in pain. "I'll leave as soon as I can walk a decent pace." Harriet opened her mouth to protest, but her words tangled. Part of her wanted to demand he leave now. Another part realized he might not survive on his own. Torn between self-preservation and the moral urge to help him finish what he started, Harriet simply nodded. That night, the storm struck with fierce winds and driving rain. Thunder cracked overhead, and lightning illuminated the desert landscape like a restless ghost. Harriet watched through the small window, heart pounding, each time a flash lit the yard, half expecting to see shapes in the darkness. Gideon dozed fitfully, dreams haunted by the promise of violence. Neither of them slept well. The storm raged outside, a reflection of the turmoil building in Harriet's once quiet life. The next day dawned grey and soggy, a rarity in the parched Arizona territory. Pools of water dotted the yard, and Harriet thanked the heavens for the replenished well. In the afternoon, she decided to seek advice from her closest neighbor, Benjamin Jensen, a rancher in his late 40s, known for his unwavering sense of justice. Though she didn't plan to spill Gideon's secret, she needed to know if the Grady gang's presence had been noticed. Saddling her old mule, Harriet told Gideon to stay hidden. He insisted he'd be fine cradling Patrick's shotgun in case of unexpected visitors. Harriet rode off, a swirl of uncertainty in her chest. When Harriet reached the Jensen ranch, she found Benjamin and his wife Claire hauling bales of hay. Two of their teenage boys helped their scrawny frames straining. Harriet dismounted, pulling the reins of her mule. "Harriet," Claire called with a welcoming smile, though her expression shifted to concern at Harriet's grim look. "Everything all right?" Harriet glanced around, voice low. "I had visitors last night, men who asked after a friend of theirs, an injured man." Benjamin's eyes narrowed. "They give you trouble?" "Threatened to come back," Harriet admitted. "They said the fella's a thief, stole gold from them." Benjamin exchanged a look with Claire. "I heard talk in town of an outlaw band sniffing around. Word is they might be the Grady gang, Leon Grady's men. They're known for stagecoach robberies and border raids." A chill gnawed at Harriet. "They wanted to search my place. I told them no." Benjamin gripped Harriet's shoulder gently. "You did right. But watch yourself, Harriet. Grady's men aren't known for mercy." Claire pursed her lips. "Maybe you should come stay with us a while." Harriet appreciated the offer, but she couldn't abandon her ranch nor Gideon. She shook her head. "I have obligations at home. But thanks for the concern." Benjamin's brow furrowed. "You sure everything's fine?" "You're not alone, Harriet. If you're in trouble." "I'll be careful," Harriet promised, glancing at the dusty horizon. Anxiety pooled in her stomach like a lead weight. "I just wanted to warn you. If you see these men, best to keep your distance." After a few more hushed words, Harriet rode back, troubled. At least she had the comfort of knowing the Jensens would help if trouble brewed. But Harriet couldn't risk dragging them into Gideon's predicament. When she returned to the ranch, Gideon was standing in the doorway, one arm braced on the wall, sweat on his brow. Even walking from the spare room to the front door taxed him. Harriet frowned, dismounting. "I told you to rest," she scolded gently, tying her mule. He gave a tight shrug. "Can't stand lying around. I was checking to see if you were back safe." His concern warmed something in Harriet's chest, an uncomfortable empathy. She tried to stay guarded. "The Jensens haven't seen the gang, but folks in town have. We can't risk them coming again." Gideon swallowed, wincing at a stab of pain in his side. "I'm almost strong enough to travel. Another day or two." "You might not have that long," Harriet said, recalling the men's parting words. "If they come back, they'll bring more guns. And if they find out you're here—" Gideon set his jaw, frustrated. "I can't ask you to stand against them. I'll go as soon as possible, even if it means riding out half dead." Harriet sighed, stepping past him into the house. Part of her wanted him gone, wanted her life to return to the lonely but predictable routine of feeding chickens and repairing fences. But another part, one she rarely allowed to surface, felt compelled to help him see his mission through. He had risked his life to keep that stolen fortune out of the wrong hands. That alone said something about his character, despite the questionable means. "We could try to do this the right way," Harriet suggested hesitantly. "Notify the authorities, let them handle it." Gideon's face fell. Authorities. Like old Sheriff John Bean in Tombstone. He's more likely to take the gold for himself. I've heard stories. He referenced a real figure, Sheriff John Harris Bean, who indeed had a reputation for corruption. Harriet bit her lip, remembering how the West's lawmen could be as crooked as the criminals they pursued. "Sometimes you can't rely on the law," Gideon continued, voice soft. "If we do that, we'll lose any chance of making things right. The coins will vanish into pockets that are just as bloody as Grady's." Harriet studied him, conflicted. "Then what do you propose if I can just reach Tucson?" Gideon said, leaning heavily on the door. "I know a man there, Henry C. Hooker, a rancher who used to supply cavalry. Heard of him?" Harriet had indeed heard of Henry Hooker. A real cattle baron near the Sierra Bonita Ranch, known occasionally to help people in a jam. "Not personally," she admitted. "But folks speak of him. Hooker has connections." Gideon went on, eyes burning with determination. "He can get these coins back to the rightful owners, maybe turn them in to the federal marshals. He has clout they'll listen to, at least more clout than a nobody drifter like me." A plan formed in Harriet's mind, though fear tugged at her. "That's a 2-day ride if you push it." "I'll manage," Gideon replied, attempting a confident tone. Harriet noticed the trembling in his hand as he gripped the door. She inhaled slowly, making a decision. "I'll help you," she said, surprising herself. "But we need a strategy. If those men show up while we're gone, I'll lose everything I own. I need to alert the Jensens. Maybe they can keep an eye on the place." Gideon's eyes lit with gratitude. "Harriet, I don't thank me," she cut in. "I'm not doing this for you alone. I'm doing it because I don't abide the idea of innocent folks being killed if that gold falls back into Grady's hands. And I sure as hell don't want them on my doorstep." Gideon nodded, appreciating her blunt honesty. "We should leave at first light, before they have a chance to catch wind." Harriet moved to gather supplies for the journey. As she counted bullets for her revolver, her heart thudded with a mixture of resolve and trepidation. Life had been simple, if lonely, before Gideon's arrival. Now she was stepping into a swirl of danger, trusting in her own grit, and the tenuous alliance with a man whose past was as shadowed as the desert at twilight. Dawn broke with a fiery glow along the horizon. Harriet had spent a restless night preparing. She wrote a quick note for Benjamin Jensen, asking him to watch the ranch, explaining only that urgent business pulled her away. She left it tacked to her kitchen door so the Jensens would see it if they came by. Gideon's wound still pained him, but he insisted he could ride. Harriet lent him one of her sturdier horses, her prized bay mare, Daisy, while she rode her mule. The morning air was brisk, carrying the scent of damp earth from the recent storm. They set off quietly, tension unspoken between them. Harriet kept her rifle sheathed at her side, her revolver in a holster. Gideon had Patrick's old shotgun strapped to his saddle. In the distance, clouds drifted lazily over the jagged mountains. For hours they rode in near silence, the desert landscape rolling past in muted colors of red and gold. Occasionally Gideon would press a hand to his side, grimacing, but he never complained. Harriet noted the perspiration beading on his forehead. Even in the cool dawn, he was fighting pain. By midday, they reached a narrow canyon where the road snaked between high walls of sandstone. Harriet's nerves were stretched taut. This place was perfect for an ambush. She signaled Gideon to slow. No sense rushing blindly, she muttered, scanning the canyon rim. Gideon nodded, eyes narrowed. "We'll need to ride single file. Keep a watch above." They entered the canyon, the hooves of their mounts echoing off the rocky walls. Harriet's heart thumped in her chest, every sense on alert. Each shadow seemed a potential threat. A hawk circled overhead, shrieking. She tried to calm her breathing. Halfway through the canyon, a sudden shout rang out. "Stop right there!" Harriet's horse spooked, and Gideon cursed, pulling his reins. 4 men appeared on the ridge above them, rifles aimed. Harriet's eyes flicked around. They were outnumbered and pinned down. A voice boomed from above. "Well, well, Gideon Cole, you sure took your sweet time." Harriet glanced at Gideon, who looked ready to spit nails. "Leon Grady." Gideon muttered under his breath. The man who spoke stepped forward, sneering. Harriet could see he was a lanky figure in a dusty hat, a red bandana around his neck. "Heard you were trying to skip out, Gideon. That's mighty unfriendly considering you got something of ours." "Not yours," Grady Gideon called back, trying to sound calm. "You stole it from the stage and you know it." Grady laughed. "And you helped remember one man's theft is another man's profit." His gaze shifted to Harriet, leering. "And who's this pretty helper? Didn't know you travelled with a lady nurse." Harriet stiffened, anger flaring in her chest. She reached slowly for her revolver. "Don't even think about it, ma'am." One of Grady's men barked, swinging his rifle. They were surrounded, 2 men above on each side, Grady up front. Harriet's mind raced. If they tried to bolt, they'd be shot off their horses. She glanced at Gideon, a silent question in her eyes. Now what? Grady grinned with a predatory gleam. "Tell you what, Gideon, why don't you hand over them coins and we'll forget you tried to double-cross us? We might even let you and the lady ride away." Gideon scowled. "I don't have them with me, Grady. They're hidden." "That so?" Grady let out a bark of laughter. "I'd have expected you to keep a sample in your pocket. Something for a rainy day." Without warning, Grady fired a shot into the air. The horses neighed, shifting nervously. Harriet's heart pounded. "You better remember who you're dealing with, boy," Grady growled. "You either tell me where that stash is, or I'll feed your corpses to the vultures." Harriet felt fury swell. She wouldn't be intimidated, but she also knew the odds. 4-2 from higher ground. Gideon's side was still healing. It was a near-suicidal standoff. Gideon's jaw worked, frustration etched in every line of his face. "I can show you," he finally said. "But it's not here." Grady eyed him suspiciously. "You leading me on a wild goose chase?" "It's real," Gideon insisted. "I hid it near Harriet's ranch. If I wanted to double-cross you, I wouldn't come this far. I'm just trying to pass through." Harriet's pulse hammered. She realized Gideon was improvising. He was lying, stalling, trying to buy a moment. But the mention of her ranch made her uneasy. Was he trying to draw them away from the canyon? Grady nodded slowly. "All right, take us there." He turned to his men. "Lyle, Toby, you keep your sights on them. We'll ride in nice and slow." Harriet shot Gideon a warning glare. "You're leading them right to my home," she hissed under her breath. "Trust me," Gideon whispered. Harriet wanted to protest, but Grady gestured with his rifle. "Move along." With guns trained on them, Harriet and Gideon had no choice. They reversed their route, heading back out of the canyon, flanked by Grady and 2 of his men on the ridges, while the other 2 followed at a distance on horseback. The journey felt excruciating, every step loaded with dread. When they finally cleared the canyon, Grady and his men descended to join them on the flat. "We'll camp soon," Grady announced. "Then we'll see about that gold." Harriet's mind whirled. She had to find a way to alert the Jensens or lead these men astray. She glanced at Gideon, who kept his gaze forward. Pain etched in his face. The group made camp near a creek, tethering their horses under scrubby mesquite trees. The outlaws kept Harriet and Gideon in close watch, forcing them to dismount. A silent tension settled. As night fell, the outlaws built a small fire, passing around a flask. Harriet and Gideon were kept apart, each guarded by a different member of the gang. Harriet sized them up, Lyle, the tall man, with a greasy beard smirking at her from across the flames. Toby, short and stocky, who never smiled. Another named Boone, who rarely spoke. and Grady their ringleader every inch the cunning predator. Leaning forward, Grady addressed Harriet. "So how'd Gideon rope you into this, ma'am?" Harriet forced a calm tone. "I found him shot up on my land. I nursed him, that's all." Grady's eyes flicked to Gideon. "He's good at that, playing the victim." Gideon stared into the fire, silent. Harriet sensed the tension in him. She wondered if Gideon had a plan to break free, or if he'd simply resigned himself to delivering some portion of the gold to keep them alive. Later, when the outlaws dozed in shifts, Harriet managed to slip Gideon a glance. In the flickering light he murmured so softly, she barely heard, "Stay alert. I've got an idea. But we might have to run." Harriet gave a subtle nod, her heart pounding. She rested leaning against a boulder, feigning fatigue while her mind churned. Dawn was only a few hours away. By morning, they'd be forced to guide Grady to a non-existent stash. How would Gideon pull this off? Unbeknownst to Harriet, a separate threat loomed. Word of Grady's movements had reached Sheriff John Bean in Tombstone, along with rumors that Gideon Cole possessed a fortune in gold. Behan had quietly mustered a posse eager to stake his own claim. By the next sunrise, multiple fates would collide in a deadly dance over that stash of glittering coins. At first light, Grady wasted no time. "Saddle up," he barked, kicking dirt over the remains of the campfire. The outlaws hustled Harriet and Gideon onto their horses, forming a tight formation around them. They headed in the direction of Harriet's ranch, the sun rising in a blaze of orange behind them. Gideon winced each time Daisy's gait jostled his healing wound, but he kept his composure. Harriet rode her mule, scanning the terrain, trying to piece together an escape. A few miles out, they reached a fork in the trail. One way led toward Harriet's ranch. The other snaked off into rocky hills. Gideon guided Daisy toward the latter. Grady frowned. "I thought you said it was near her place." "It is," Gideon replied smoothly. "But we gotta swing around to approach from the back ridge. Can't bury gold near a homestead without being discreet." Grady's eyes narrowed. "Just don't be playing us for fools." They followed the winding path through sparse juniper and yucca plants. Harriet's nerves twitched. She wasn't sure how Gideon intended to spin this lie. The gang was armed and suspicious. After about an hour, they crested a ridge overlooking a shallow valley. Harriet recognized it as farmland, on the outskirts of her neighbor's property. Anxiety gripped her. If the Jensens see them... Suddenly, Gideon leaned to Harriet, whispering under his breath, "On my signal ride hard to those cottonwoods. You see 'em?" Harriet peered ahead. Yes, a stand of cottonwood trees near the far side of the valley. She nodded imperceptibly. Grady was watching them. "Hey, what are you two mumbling about?" Gideon faked a cough, grimacing. "Just telling her to watch for rattlers. Last time I was out here, nearly got bit." Grady snorted, clearly unconvinced. But Toby, riding behind Harriet, jabbed his gun into her side, a warning. Harriet forced her expression neutral. They descended into the valley, the ground leveling out with patches of tall grass. That's when Gideon suddenly grabbed the shotgun strapped to his saddle and spun, firing at Lyle. The shot blasted wide, but it startled the outlaws into chaos. Harriet dug her heels into her mule, bolting forward. Shouts rang out. Grady let out a furious yell, spurring his horse. Harriet heard a bullet zing past her ear. She ducked, heart pounding. Gideon fired again, forcing Toby and Boone to scatter. Dust kicked up around them, the animals rearing and whinnying. Harriet urged her mule, racing toward the cottonwoods. Gideon was right behind her, leaning low on Daisy's neck, blood trickling anew from his side. Grady's men unleashed a hail of gunfire, splintering branches overhead. Harriet felt a sharp sting on her arm as a bullet grazed her, but she pressed on. Within moments, Harriet and Gideon reached the cluster of cottonwoods. She yanked her mule around, looking back. The outlaws galloped in pursuit, guns raised. Gideon leapt off Daisy, staggering a bit, and took cover behind a thick trunk. Harriet followed suit, pulling her rifle free. Her arm throbbed, but adrenaline surged. Grady and his men dismounted a short distance away, seeking cover in the brush. A tense standoff began. Gunshots crackled, snapping branches and sending bark flying. Harriet fired back, determined to protect Gideon. She spotted Toby creeping around to flank them, and managed a shot that forced him to dive behind a rock. "Gideon," she called, reloading frantically. "We can't hold them off forever." Just then more gunshots echoed from another direction. Harriet glimpsed men on horseback, a posse led by none other than Sheriff John Behan. The sheriff's voice boomed, "Throw down your weapons by order of the law." Grady cursed. "Damn it! It's Behan." The posse galloped in, guns blazing. The outlaws found themselves caught in a crossfire, Harriet and Gideon behind the cottonwoods. Behan's posse from the open plain. Grady roared for his men to fight. Bullets sang through the air. Harriet crouched beside Gideon. "We gotta move," he nodded. Together they slipped away from the cottonwoods, using the chaos to skirt around. Behan's men thundered past, engaging in a fierce gun battle with the Grady gang. Harriet saw Toby fall from his horse, clutching his chest. Lyle screamed as a bullet struck his leg. Grady himself tried to run, spurring his horse, but a deputy's rifle cracked and Grady tumbled off. Dust rose around him, and Harriet lost sight in the confusion. As the smoke and chaos swirled, Harriet and Gideon slipped farther from the melee. Gideon was bleeding through his bandage face drawn. Harriet steadied him, her own arm burning from the graze. They scrambled behind a low ridge, out of direct lines of fire. Then Harriet spotted a familiar figure, Benjamin Jensen, riding up with two of his sons carrying shotguns. It appeared the Jensens had joined Behan's posse, were at least supporting them to protect the region from the Grady gang. Harriet's heart leapt with relief and concern. She waved, stepping forward. "Benjamin!" He reined his horse eyes wide with shock at seeing Harriet in the thick of it. "My God, Harriet! Gideon's wounded," Harriet said urgently. "We need to get him to a doctor." Benjamin nodded, calling to his sons. "Cover us!" They assisted Harriet in propping Gideon on her mule. Meanwhile, the gun battle wound down. Several outlaws lay wounded or dead. Sheriff Behan was already striding among the fallen, ensuring the Grady gang was finished. Behan caught sight of Harriet and Gideon. "Hold it!" he hollered, brandishing his revolver. "You two aren't going anywhere." I heard. "Cole's got gold that belongs to the territory." Harriet stepped between Behan and Gideon, rifle in hand. "He didn't steal it." "Sheriff, you're after the wrong man." Behan smirked. "That's not how I heard it. Hand over the fortune, and I might let you walk." Benjamin intervened, voice gruff. "Let them go, Behan. The man's shot, and Harriet's not some damned criminal." Behan glared, but the roar of a deputy calling his name pulled him away. The deputy was rummaging in Grady's saddlebags, likely looking for stolen loot. Several members of the posse had begun gathering the wounded outlaws. Sensing their chance, Harriet and Benjamin led Gideon away from the carnage. The sheriff was too busy dealing with the gang's downfall to chase them outright. Harriet's heart hammered with relief, though her mind whirled. Would Behan come after them later? As they crested a rise, Harriet paused, looking back at the swirling dust of gun smoke and the bodies. Leon Grady was being hoisted onto the back of a wagon, presumably still alive, but barely. She swallowed hard, feeling no pity for him, only sorrow at the violence. "Let's get Gideon to the ranch," Benjamin said gently. "Then we'll figure out our next step." Harriet nodded, guiding her mule and the injured Gideon. Her wound stung, her lungs burned with the lingering tang of gunpowder. The world had turned upside down in a single morning, and Harriet couldn't shake the sense that her life would never return to the quiet monotony she'd once known. Back at Harriet's ranch, they settled Gideon on her bed again. The bullet that struck him during the skirmish had reopened his wound, though he was fortunate it wasn't deeper. Harriet cleaned it her own arm, hastily wrapped by Claire Jensen, who arrived soon after with more supplies. Benjamin hovered, glancing anxiously out the window. "If Sheriff Bean decides to come for you." Harriet met his gaze. "I know." She felt weary to her bones. Gideon's eyes fluttered open, voice weak. "I'm sorry. Got you in this mess." Harriet forced a tired smile. "We're alive. That's what matters." Later that evening, after Benjamin and Claire had gone, Harriet found herself alone at Gideon's bedside. The house was quiet, lit by a single lantern. She noticed the lines of pain in Gideon's face relaxing as he drifted in and out of restless sleep. She recalled the gold coin he had shown her, the swirl of secrets and danger that had upended her life. Despite the chaos, Harriet felt an odd sense of purpose. She had stood up to outlaws, a corrupt sheriff, and her own fears. Perhaps that was something to be proud of. A few days passed in cautious peace. Gideon slowly mended. The Jensens reported that Sheriff Bean had left the area presumably satisfied with hauling Grady and what remained of the gang to Tombstone to face justice. The stolen coins found in Grady's saddlebags would likely become evidence. Yet the lion's share of Gideon's stash, those minted coins, remained hidden. Harriet wondered if the posse even realized they hadn't recovered all of them. Once Gideon could stand and walk without doubling over, Harriet confronted him in the kitchen. "The gold. Where is it really?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Buried in a canyon near Willow Creek. I stashed it before I came across your place, so it was never near my ranch." He shook his head. "I wouldn't put you at risk like that." Harriet was both relieved and exasperated. "You told Grady it was here." Gideon offered a sheepish grin. "I had to stall. Sorry." Harriet let out a long breath, a mix of frustration and gratitude. Now what his gaze traveled to the horizon beyond the window. "I still plan to get it to Henry Hooker in Tucson if I can. That was always the plan, to ensure it goes to someone with the clout to see it returned, or at least used to help those who Grady planned to exploit." Harriet studied him. "You still trust Hooker?" "He's got a reputation for being honorable," Gideon said. "At least more so than your average rancher or lawman." An uneasy silence settled. Harriet's mind churned. If Gideon left now, he was still a wanted man in Behan's eyes. But if he succeeded in handing over the gold, maybe he could clear his name. On a calm afternoon, when Gideon could finally mount a horse without collapsing, Harriet saddled Daisy. "I'm coming with you," she announced. Gideon blinked, but she raised a hand, cutting him off. "I'm not letting you ride off alone with a gang of vultures still possibly roaming. I want to see this to the end. Besides, after what we've been through, I can't just sit here and wonder." A flicker of warmth passed over Gideon's face. He swallowed. "Thank you." And so they set out, traveling cautiously. Harriet left word with Benjamin Jensen again, and they rode for Willow Creek under discreet cover. There, in a narrow crevice, Gideon retrieved a small wooden crate filled with coins. Harriet's breath caught at the sight of them, bright discs shimmering even in the gloom. Such wealth could change lives, she thought. But it was also a magnet for danger. They headed southeast, skirting Tombstone, to avoid Sheriff Bean traveling for days over rugged trails. Harriet's arm healed slowly, her determination fueling each mile. Gideon's side ached, but he pressed on, driven by the conviction that he had to do what was right. Eventually they crossed a stretch of desert to the outskirts of the Sierra Bonita Ranch, Henry Hooker's domain. It was a sprawling empire of cattle adobe structures and corrals as far as the eye could see. Workers bustled about, and Harriet felt a pang of uncertainty. Would Hooker truly help them? They were ushered to a large ranch house where a stern foreman sized them up. When Gideon mentioned his purpose and the nature of the cargo, the foreman's eyes widened. He promptly fetched Hooker. Henry C. Hooker arrived an imposing man in his 50s, broad-shouldered with a neatly trimmed mustache. He had the air of someone used to command. With calm curiosity, he listened to Gideon's story. When Gideon opened the crate to reveal the glinting coins, Hooker let out a low whistle. "Emperor Maximilian's mint," he murmured. "I've seen a few, but never this many." Gideon explained how Grady had planned to use them, how Harriet had saved him, how they'd barely escaped with their lives. Hooker stroked his chin thoughtfully. "I can see why you didn't trust the local law. Behan's not exactly a shining knight. But you want me to hand this over to the feds?" Gideon nodded. "Or whoever you deem rightful. It should be returned to the stage line or the original owners. I just want no part of it." Hooker considered them both, then gave a slow, approving nod. "You did a brave thing. Not many out here would risk so much to keep this out of the wrong hands. I'll contact some people I know in the federal marshal's office. They're more trustworthy than the usual bunch. We'll see about returning it officially." Relief washed over Harriet, though a question lingered. "What about Gideon?" she asked. "He's still wanted by certain folks, lawmen who don't know the truth." Hooker's gaze settled on Gideon. "I'll do what I can. In the meantime, you can stay here under my protection until we sort this out. You have my word." Gideon exhaled shakily. "Thank you. Both of you." He turned to Harriet, his eyes reflecting a deep gratitude that words couldn't convey. They ended up staying at the ranch for a week, during which Hooker used his contacts to ensure Gideon's name was cleared. Documents were sent to the U.S. Marshals, describing how Gideon had turned over the gold with Harriet as a witness. Harriet penned her own statement. Eventually word came back that Gideon Cole would not be prosecuted. No direct evidence tied him to the stage robbery. Leon Grady and his men, on the other hand, faced the gallows. One evening, Harriet strolled the ranch yard under a luminous desert moon. She found Gideon leaning against a paddock fence, watching the horses graze. The silver light showed the healing scar beneath his shirt. "Seems you're free to go wherever you please," Harriet said softly. "No bounty on your head. Quite a change from when I found you." Gideon offered a faint smile. "Funny how life can shift in a matter of weeks. Because of you. I'd be dead if not for your kindness." Harriet shrugged, hands in her pockets. "Part of me wonders how I'll slip back into normal life on my ranch." Gideon studied her face. "You don't have to slip back into anything if you don't want to." She felt her heart flutter uncertain. "Not sure what you're implying." "I'm grateful to you," Gideon said, voice low. "But that's not the only reason I'd ask you to come along with me. If you wanted. I've grown fond of you, Harriet. I know it's sudden, but these days we've spent the risks we took. It's made me realize I don't want to keep drifting alone." Harriet's eyes misted unexpectedly. She thought of Patrick, her late husband, the lonely years after. Then she considered the spark she felt with Gideon, the sense of partnership forged through adversity. But her home was that little ranch. Could she leave? Gideon saw her hesitation. "I don't expect anything," he added softly. "You've given enough." Harriet's gaze lifted to the stars. "My husband died out there," she whispered. "I told myself I'd never love again. But you've broken through walls I didn't know were there." They stood in the moonlight, silent for a moment. Finally, Harriet reached out and took Gideon's hand. "I can't just abandon my ranch. It's Patrick's legacy. But if you wanted to stay with me, there's room on that land for 2 hearts." A soft laugh escaped Gideon, eyes brimming with relief. "I'd like that, for as long as you'll have me." Their clasped hands trembled with the raw intensity of a new beginning. Overhead, the desert sky stretched infinite, silent witness to the possibility of hope after so much hardship. Harriet felt a long, absent warmth fill her chest. She had no idea what tomorrow might bring, but for once, she wasn't afraid. 3 weeks later, Harriet and Gideon returned to her ranch. They found the Jensens had watched over the place, ensuring no looters or stragglers from Grady's gang caused trouble. Life on the frontier would continue, feeding livestock, fixing fences, sowing seeds, building a future from the dust. And yet one crucial detail had changed. Harriet Dunn was no longer alone, nor was Gideon Cole doomed to wander. Their union was tested in fire and blood, forged by a shared resolve to do what was right. Together they discovered that sometimes the greatest fortune in the West wasn't gold, but finding someone worth riding beside through the harsh desert nights and the uncertain dawns ahead. And so ends the story of Harriet Dunn and Gideon Cole. 2 strangers turned partners on a lawless frontier. Through danger, betrayal, and buried treasure, they found something far greater: trust, love, and a new beginning. If this tale stirred your heart or sparked your love for Western grit and redemption, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let's keep stories like theirs alive. Thanks for watching.